Welcome to Inside Outside Innovation, episode 79. Today's show is with Atul Kamra. He is a managing partner at SixThirty, which is a seed fund based out of St. Louis. Atul talked about what makes SixThirty unique, what attitude is best for combining startups and corporations, and how to keep a narrow focus to stay on track for your goals. His contact info is in the show notes. Hey everyone, I'm Victory Clafter, the producer for Inside Outside Innovation. This is the podcast that brings you the latest insights from people who know the most about building lean businesses, innovating within corporations, and disrupting entire industries with passion and precision. Learn more at insideoutside.io or econic.co. Now, let's get started.
SixThirty is a global fintech seed fund and go-to-market program. SixThirty gets its name from the height of the arch, the height and the span of the arch in St. Louis. So it's sort of symbolic to our work and our focus. We're in the business of connecting some of the most promising ideas in the fintech and information security world. And working with like-minded corporate partners, financial services and technology incumbents specifically, to attract them, coach them, and mentor them into great businesses. That's at the heart of what we do. Our focus is entirely B2B. I think we were very early on in the point of view, while lots of fintech had an edge and was sort of positioned as being disruptive. We fundamentally took a point of view that fintech was going to play far more collaboratively with incumbents. And so our positioning in working fintech startups and corporate incumbents, FS, financial services corporate incumbents, on a platform to both absorb innovation for the incumbents and find markets and access and relationships for the startups. That's at the heart of what we do.
I love it. And you know, that's an interesting take on it because, you know, a lot of times you hear startups and you think about the disruption and how they're changing industries over and over again. A lot of times it's difficult for corporates to kind of wrap their head around that disruption and actually not only wrap their head around it, but then actively go out or proactively go out and say, how do I engage with startups? So what are some of the trends that you're seeing with regard to corporations, big players in this space, actively raising their hand and saying, I need some help with innovation, or I need to partner or look at startups as a mechanism for that?
I would say the leading incumbents probably have three most significant needs, right? They want to organize their intelligence, their market intelligence. They want to have a really panoramic view of the forces out there that could disrupt their business, right? So they really want to have one. Two, they want a way or a platform or some method or process by which they can absorb that innovation, make it easy to bring it in. And sort of related to that, but yet different, is a way in which they can engage their high potential talent and their clients in that process of absorbing innovation. Right? I think those are core needs. I think the most useful companies are ones that, while recognize that there is disruption, also don't necessarily think it has to be fundamentally disruptive, but have an attitude to be helpful. And so our approach to the business recognizes the need to, organize and augment your market intelligence, engage your high potential talent, and put you in a position to work with your peers and startups to absorb innovation and take an attitude of helpfulness rather than an attitude of intimidation and disruption. I think when you put those right sets of mechanisms in place, I think you get the right dynamics. You get to the issues that large incumbents face around managing change, managing absorption, sort of go-to-market, sort of lead time and costs, and work into their sort of macro agendas while recognizing their constraints and leveraging their assets. I think you can get some really good chemistry going between startups and incumbents. Incumbents have very significant advantages. They have, regulators on their side in many ways. They've got customers, and they've got some strong risk management processes in place. So those are to be leveraged.
Yeah, and typically they have a business model that's been in place for a long time that allows them to take some risks because they've got they're not going to be out of cash in a couple of weeks like a startup can be. So
yeah, and brands, and they have brands.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're right.
Exactly. So tell me a little bit about some of the maybe some success stories, or exactly how does 630 work, and how do you help pull this whole puzzle pieces together?
So I'd say that our approach to the business is very focused, right? One, we're focused on B2B, right? We're not in B2C propositions. We invest in B2B and B2B2C businesses. Second, our focus is revenue. So we would work with fintech startups that have a working product, that have market traction and early revenue, and they're at the point in time in which they really need to scale their business models and are looking to accelerate revenues, at which point there's a lot of pressure on the business model and key business questions. How do I go to market? Do I use a channel partner? How do I price my business? What kind of sales force I need to have? What are my unit economics going to look like? Those are those pressure questions that they face at point in time in which they're now sort of reflecting and looking at significant inflection in their business. So that's a big portion of our value proposition is a revenue focus. We're in the business of accelerating relationships and revenues. Third, we don't work with 15, 20, 30 companies at a time. We work with 4 or 5 startups at a time, and so we give them a lot of attention. There's some very detailed, hands-on, call it sort of working in the trenches between the corporate executives, subject matter experts, my venture partners, my general partners, with the entrepreneur, with the CEO or the CEO of a startup in helping them accelerate revenues. We also, from a programmatic standpoint, we don't treat our portfolio companies like a lot of programs do as graduates. We work with our companies well beyond the time they spend time with us in the go-to-market or the business development program. And so that puts us in a sort of a interesting place where we have, deep, long-standing relationships with the incumbents, with our startups, well beyond the time they spend time with us in St. Louis in the business development program. And lastly, I would say, we're a two-sided program. We are actively working with incumbents to solve for the 3 things that I talked about that incumbents really need, right? The intelligence, the ability to absorb innovation, and the ability to engage their high potential talent and their clients. So those are the 5 sort of factors that we use sort of deploy on an ongoing basis, and I think they differentiate us. So B2B, a revenue focus, a few companies with a lot of access and attention, treating them as portfolio companies. They are our portfolio companies. And lastly, a two-sided platform where both incumbents and their needs are served, while startups and their need for access are served. So I would say that's our approach to market. That's our approach to the fintech and information security environment and opportunity.
So take me back to when you were first getting started. You have been in the space for longer than a lot of folks. And so, what are some of the changes or things that you've seen happened in the funding landscape and in the startup corporate collaborative space that have changed over the years that have affected your model and affected the ability for companies to get benefit out of this model?
So a couple of observations here. One, sort of let's say on the side of the category of startups that have gotten traction. So I would say, when the fintech world got, a fair amount of journalistic energy and ink, lots of talk about sort of, I would say, industry verticals like robo-advice, right? We see far more traction today, not for sort of industry verticals, but I would say horizontals, like information security, like blockchain, like artificial intelligence. And I think those categories, like Reg and compliance that cut across, financial services industry verticals and deploy data in very interesting ways, but don't necessarily challenge head-on sort of any given industry vertical. So we see that significant amount of traction in what I would call the horizontal category.
Mm-hmm.
Second, and sort of alongside it, but again different, is I think originally there was a lot of sort of attention on what I would call shiny objects, right? And I think there's much more sobriety around the fact that, here's a shiny object, let me go chase it, versus how does this idea activate behavior? How does it ultimately integrate with core systems and therefore has high implementability? And how does it leverage data in a way that goes from purely analytics to actually good decisions and superior decisions, both for the incumbent, the provider, as well as the client of the financial services incumbent? And I think that's a very big shift, which is not just a shiny object, but much, much more consciousness around sort of front, middle, back, understanding, leveraging, data, interaction data, demographic data, transactional data, much more sensitivity around implementability, much more sensitivity around design and activation, and sort of away from this sort of attention to just purely shiny objects. And thirdly, I would say much more from an incumbent standpoint, much more consciousness on their part around making sure they bring sort of their technology groups, their innovation group, and their lines of business, and if appropriate, given how they're approaching the market, their corporate development teams along, rather than having them doing them sort of separately. And in our case, we're often a catalyst for bringing the tech group, the line of business, and the innovation group sort of together as they attack a certain opportunity or figure out how to absorb an innovative idea into their organization and or spread and drive activation and implementability around it. So I would say those three sort of stand out: shiny objects, much more sort of intentional activity across generally silos in the organizations, and then a focus equally, or if not more, on capabilities rather than just verticals.
And I'm imagining a lot of that's been learned from, incumbents actually being a part of what's going on at 630. And that, how do incumbents kind of play a role in the program itself? Are they primarily mentors? Are they funders? How do they actually engage with startups?
Yeah, so our corporate partners, our financial service incumbents, are with us from the very, right from sort of, I would say, front to back. So they would generally invest in us and invest in the fund, in the seed fund. Mm-hmm. So they start right there. Their teams are actively involved in the evaluation and the selection of the startups that we work with. So the CIO of Edward Jones, the CIO of State Farm Bank, the head of capital markets at UMB, the head of innovation at RGA, all these players actually sit on the 630 investment committee and are part of the process with their team members on evaluating and selecting the ideas we come around and invest with.
Right, so they're more than just LPs.
Yeah, they're more than LPs, right? Their teams are generally assigned and or decide on their own which portfolio companies that they're actually going to work with and mentor and coach. And some of it might mean bringing that idea in and doing a proof of concept or a proof of value with it, or buying it from a vendor standpoint. It could be co-investing with us, like has happened. They could follow on, invest with the ideas after they've seen them work, and we have some very sort of refined processes to enable our corporate partners to co-invest with us and or follow on invest with us. And then sort of, I would say, from a timing standpoint, there's some ideas that some incumbents are ready for today, and there's some ideas that become relevant to an incumbent well after the time we've sort of invested in them and or they spend time with us in our go-to-market program. Right. And so an ongoing engagement with our portfolio companies is something our portfolio management group at 630 manages so that we stay in front of both the startup as well as our network of incumbents, as well as their respective networks, right? So RGA, which is the third largest life insurance company in the world, has a large network of insurance companies. As they sort of, UMB has a very large correspondent banking business, right? They have in the regional space, and so they have a fabulous network of correspondent banks they work with. So they individually have their own networks, which provide us an opportunity to expose these ideas way beyond the individual incumbents themselves, but their own networks and their own client bases, which increases their own specific relevance to their markets and to their clients.
Very good, very good. Well, one last question. So what's next for 630 and for you and some of the new trends that you're seeing out there?
So I would say the one thing, let me start with what's going to remain constant, right? What's going to remain constant for us is this focus on B2B. We're very global. More than half our pipeline is non-US, and we see some of the bravest ideas coming from Asia. We're going to continue with our focus on data and design. I often say fintech is where data and design meet money. Mm-hmm. That cuts across insight, activation, and implementability of those ideas. Insight from a client standpoint, design driving client behavior, and implementability ultimately driving whether or not an incumbent's in a position to absorb the idea. So those are going to remain very constant with us. We're seeing our pipeline incredibly healthy, which is forcing us to build out a bigger fund. And so spring next year, we'll be launching 630 2.0, which will be a fund that's 2.5 the size of the current fund. We'll be, in a position to absorb, 10 to 14 ideas every year. We'll bring on a few more corporate incumbents as well that like the model, like the innovation platform we put in place to both provide them competitive intelligence around what's going on in the fintech space and organize it and augment what they do, but also, appropriately apply their talent and their clients in the process of absorbing innovation. We're also actively looking at working with a couple of leading technology players to build out a tech lab with them to play out the implementability part of this in rapid ways, but also in a safe and secure way. So, some well-established tech players that incumbents can feel safe working with, but also provide an environment in which the startup's technology or their innovation can be tested in a rapid and yet secure way. So I would say more capital brought to these ideas together with the same deep sort of engagement between startups and incumbents, along with resources to drive more experimentation, more rapid experimentation in a more safe and secure way.
That's the end of another episode of Inside Outside Innovation. Thanks for listening, and thanks to Atul for coming on the show. If you've got some thoughts about how we can make the show fit your needs better, send us a note at the IO Podcast on Twitter or at insideoutside.io. Until next time, go out and innovate.